Thunder roared across the wide Montana sky as Lillian Vance clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma tighter to her chest, the rain pelting against the canvas cover of the wagon with merciless fury. It was supposed to be a simple journey to Angel's Camp to start anew after her husband's passing, but nature had other plans on this unforgiving April evening in 1876. "Hold on," she shouted to the driver, an elderly man she'd hired in the last town. But her words were lost to the howling wind as lightning split the darkness, illuminating the treacherous mountain path ahead. The horses whinnied in terror, rearing up as another bolt struck too close for comfort. Lillian felt the wagon lurch violently to one side. Everything slowed down as she realized they were tipping, sliding off the muddy trail toward the slope below. Her baby's cries pierced through the cacophony of the storm as the wagon overturned, throwing Lillian against the side. Pain shot through her shoulder as she desperately shielded Emma with her body, wood splintered. Canvas tore. Supplies scattered into the darkness, and then they were rolling, tumbling down the incline with nothing to stop their descent. When the wagon finally crashed to a halt against a stand of pines, Lillian was dazed, rain pouring in through the torn canvas. The driver was nowhere to be seen. Panic seized her as she realized her baby wasn't in her arms anymore. Emma. She screamed, frantically searching through the jumbled belongings. Emma, a baby's wail answered her, but it seemed to come from outside the overturned wagon. Lillian crawled through the wreckage, ignoring the sharp pain in her leg, and emerged into the storm to find a tall figure standing in the rain, cradling her child. For one terrifying moment, she thought some mountain predator had found them. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the broad shoulders and Stetson hat of a man, a cowboy, holding Emma with surprising gentleness, checking her for injuries. "She seems all right, madam," he called over the storm, his voice deep and steady. He carefully tucked the baby inside his coat to shield her from the rain, then stepped forward, extending his free hand toward Lillian, who was still half trapped in the wreckage. "Give me your hand. This wagon could slide further any minute." Lillian hesitated only a moment before reaching out. His grip was strong and sure as he pulled her from the twisted wood and metal, lifting her to safety just as the wagon creaked ominously and slid another few feet down the slope. "Hugh Irwin," he introduced himself simply, still holding her baby protectively against his chest. "My cabin's not far. We need to get you both out of this storm." Lightning illuminated his face, rugged, bearded, with kind eyes that somehow managed to be both wary and concerned. Lillian's legs buckled beneath her, the shock and pain finally catching up. Hugh Irwin moved quickly, adjusting Emma to one arm while supporting Lillian with the other. "Can you walk, madam?" "Lillian," she managed through chattering teeth. "Lillian Vance and I think so." "Well, Miss Vance," he said, guiding her up the slope toward higher ground, "you and your little one picked a hell of a night to be traveling these parts." As they struggled through the mud and rain, Lillian cast one last glance at the ruined wagon containing everything she owned in the world. All her hopes for a new beginning in Angel's Camp seemed to be washing away in the torrent. "Don't worry about your things," Hugh said, as if reading her thoughts. "We'll come back for what we can salvage when the storm passes. Right now, let's get you and this little one somewhere dry and warm." Lillian had no choice but to trust this stranger who had appeared like an apparition in the storm, this cowboy who had lifted her baby first, then reached back for her hand. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a mirage, small but sturdy, with a porch that provided immediate shelter from the deluge. Hugh shifted the still whimpering Emma in his arms as he pushed open the door. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's dry." Lillian stepped inside, grateful for the immediate absence of rain. The cabin was indeed simple, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves lined with supplies. It was the home of a man who lived alone and needed little. Hugh moved efficiently, placing Emma gently in Lillian's arms before kneeling at the fireplace. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling, pushing back the damp chill of the night. "You're hurt," he observed, nodding toward the blood seeping through her torn skirt. "It's nothing," Lillian said automatically, though her leg throbbed painfully. Hugh gave her a look that suggested he didn't believe her but wouldn't press the issue yet. "Let me find something dry for you and the little one to wear. Can't have you catching your death in those wet clothes." He rummaged through a trunk and returned with a clean shirt and pair of trousers that would swallow her whole. "They'll be big, but they're dry. I don't have anything proper for a lady, I'm afraid." Lillian accepted the clothes gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." His expression darkened slightly. "Just lucky I was heading home and saw your wagon go over." He turned his attention to Emma, who had settled now that they were somewhere dry and warm. "How old?" "6 months," Lillian said, brushing a damp curl from her daughter's forehead. Hugh nodded, a strange emotion flickering across his face before he masked it. "I'll step outside while you change. There's water in the kettle if you want to warm it for the little one." Once alone, Lillian changed quickly, wincing as she peeled the wet dress away from her injured leg. A nasty gash ran from her knee halfway up her thigh. She tore a strip from her petticoat to bind it, then turned her attention to Emma, relieved to find her daughter had somehow escaped with only minor scratches. When Hugh returned, he brought an armload of wood for the fire and studiously avoided looking at her in his oversized clothing. "The storm's getting worse," he said, arranging the logs. "You're welcome to the bed, I'll take the floor by the fire." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Lillian protested. "Madam Lillian," he corrected himself, "I've slept on worse than my own floor. You and your baby need proper rest." Too exhausted to argue further, Lillian nodded. "Thank you, you've been kinder than I had any right to expect." Something like discomfort crossed his features. "Just doing what anyone would." "No," Lillian said softly, thinking of the long road from St. Louis and the many who had turned away a widow with a baby. "Not anyone." Hugh busied himself making a pallet near the fire, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "If you don't mind me asking, what brings you out to these parts with a little one?" "These mountains ain't exactly welcoming to travelers, especially not now before the spring thaw is complete." Lillian settled on the edge of the bed, cradling Emma, who had finally drifted to sleep. "We're headed to Angel's Camp. My cousin lives there. After my husband died of the fever last winter, there wasn't much left for us in St. Louis." Hugh nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Angel's Camp is still a good 3 days' journey from here, and that's in fair weather with a good wagon." The reality of her situation hit Lillian fully then. No wagon, no supplies, no driver. She suddenly realized she'd given no thought to the man who'd been driving the wagon. "The driver," she gasped. "I never even checked, I looked," Hugh said grimly. "He was thrown clear at the first tip, broke his neck in the fall, I'm sorry." Lillian closed her eyes, grief washing over her for a man whose name she barely knew. "God rest his soul." "I'll bury him proper once the storm passes," Hugh promised. "As for you and your little one, we'll figure something out. Angel's Camp is a good town. I make the trip every few months for supplies. You've been there many times. It's grown since the mining days, become more respectable, good place for a fresh start." He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Your cousin expecting you?" "Yes, though not for another week." "We were making good time until—" She glanced toward the window where rain still lashed against the glass. "I can get you there," Hugh said after a moment's consideration. "Once the weather clears, I'll take you in my wagon. Can't promise it'll be comfortable as what you had, but it'll get you there." Lillian felt tears threatening. This man owed her nothing, yet here he was, offering to escort her days out of his way. "I can't ask that of you. You didn't ask, I offered." His tone left no room for argument. "Now get some rest. Dawn comes early in these mountains." Lillian settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed, Emma tucked securely beside her. Through half-closed eyes, she watched Hugh spreading his bedroll near the fire, his movements economical and practiced. He was a man used to fending for himself, used to the solitude of the mountains. Mr. Irwin, she called softly. He glanced up. Thank you for everything. He nodded once, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Sleep well, Mrs. Vance. As she drifted toward sleep, Lillian realized she hadn't corrected his assumption that she was married. It seemed easier, somehow, to let him believe she was a widow rather than explain the truth that she had never married Emma's father, a man who had promised her the world and then vanished when he learned she was with child. In the morning, she would set things straight. For now, the rhythm of the rain and the security of knowing her baby was safe lulled her into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Dawn arrived with surprising gentleness after the violence of the night's storm. Lillian woke to find Emma already awake and being entertained by Hugh, who was making soft clicking sounds that had the baby grinning toothlessly. She's been up about an hour, Hugh explained when he noticed Lillian watching. Didn't want to wake you. You're good with her, Lillian observed, stretching carefully, mindful of her injured leg. A shadow passed over his features. Had a little sister once, long time ago. The way he said it discouraged further questions. Lillian rose, adjusting Hugh's oversized clothes around her frame. I should check on that wagon, see what can be salvaged. Already did, Hugh replied. Made a trip down at first light, managed to pull some of your things from the wreck, clothes, some personal items, the rest. He shrugged apologetically. The wagon slid further down in the night. It's in pieces at the bottom of the ravine. Lillian's heart sank. Nearly everything she owned gone. And the driver, buried him proper on the ridge, said words over him best I could. Thank you. She took Emma from him, grateful for his kindness yet again. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. No need, Hugh said gruffly. Coffee's hot if you want some, and there's bacon. Not much else until I can hunt, but it'll keep body and soul together. They ate a simple breakfast in companionable silence. Hugh wasn't a man for idle chatter, Lillian observed, but there was something comforting in his quiet presence. That leg needs tending, he said finally, nodding toward her makeshift bandage where blood had seeped through. It's nothing, Lillian insisted. Hugh gave her a stern look. Infection's no joke out here, madam. Nearest doctor's in Angel's Camp. He moved to a shelf and retrieved a wooden box containing rudimentary medical supplies. I'm no sawbones, but I've patched up my share of cuts and scrapes. Lillian hesitated, then nodded, extending her injured leg. Hugh worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made her hiss in pain, then applying a salve that smelled of herbs before wrapping it with a clean bandage. Should heal clean if we keep it dressed, he said, packing away the supplies. Can you walk on it? Lillian tested her weight and winced. If I must. No rush today. Weather's cleared, but the ground's too muddy for traveling. We'll rest up, let that leg heal some, then head out tomorrow if you're able. As the day passed, Lillian learned more about her rescuer. Hugh Irwin was a man of few words but numerous skills. He trapped in the winter, ran cattle on a small piece of land during the warmer months, and occasionally guided hunting parties from the east when funds ran low. He'd been in these mountains for nearly 8 years, since shortly after the war. You fought? Lillian asked as they sat on the porch that afternoon, Emma sleeping in a makeshift cradle Hugh had fashioned from an old crate. Union, he confirmed, his eyes distant. Tennessee 4th, saw things no man should see. My husband, Lillian caught herself too late. Hugh's gaze sharpened. Your husband, heat flooded her cheeks. I'm not married, never was. Emma's father, he left when he found out I was expecting. She waited for the judgment, the disapproval she'd become accustomed to. Instead, Hugh simply nodded. Man who'd abandon his child ain't worth the breath it takes to speak of him, he said finally. The little one's lucky to have you. His easy acceptance loosened something tight in Lillian's chest. Most people aren't so understanding. Most people spend too much time worrying about others and not enough tending their own gardens, Hugh replied. Out here, a person learns quick what matters and what don't. That evening, Hugh returned from checking his trap lines with a pair of rabbits. He showed Lillian how to dress them, and they worked together preparing a stew that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months. My cousin will have a position for me in Angel's camp, Lillian explained as they ate. She runs a dressmaking shop. I'm quite skilled with a needle. Hugh nodded approvingly. Honest work. Town's growing fast enough that she likely needs the help. And do you ever think of living somewhere less remote? A complicated expression crossed his face. Tried it once, didn't take. Some men aren't meant for town life. Because of the war. He considered this, then shook his head. Not entirely. Some wounds heal with time, others, you just learn to live around them. Lillian thought she understood. She had her own wounds not from battle, but from betrayal and loss. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by Emma, taking her so far from everything familiar. Children are resilient, Hugh said, watching the baby who was contentedly playing with a wooden spoon he'd given her. And they deserve mothers who aren't afraid to seek better for them. His words stayed with Lillian as she lay awake that night, listening to the occasional pop of the fire and Hugh's steady breathing from his place on the floor. There was something about this man, this solitary mountain dweller, that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since her father was alive. The next morning brought clear skies and Hugh's declaration that they would start for Angel's camp if her leg was strong enough. Lillian tested it and found the pain manageable. Your clothes are dry, Hugh said, gesturing to her dress and petticoats which he'd laundered and hung by the fire. They're torn some, but better than traveling in my old things. While Hugh hitched his 2 horses to his wagon, a sturdy but plain affair clearly built for function rather than comfort, Lillian changed back into her own clothes, grateful to feel like herself again. It's not fancy, Hugh apologized as he helped her and Emma into the wagon, but it'll get us there. The journey began slowly, the wagon picking its way carefully down the still muddy mountain trail. Lillian held Emma in her lap, pointing out birds and deer to the curious baby as they traveled. Hugh remained mostly quiet, focused on the difficult terrain, but occasionally offered information about landmarks they passed or stories about the early settlers of the region. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow. Hugh efficiently set up a small tent for Lillian and Emma, insisting on sleeping under the wagon himself. Been meaning to ask, he said as they sat by the campfire after a simple meal. What's waiting for you in Angel's camp besides your cousin? Any other family? Lillian shook her head. No. My parents are gone. No siblings. It's just Emma and me now. Hugh nodded thoughtfully, poking at the fire. Must be hard, carrying all that responsibility alone. It is, she admitted. But I'm not the first woman to raise a child on her own, and I won't be the last. At least in Angel's camp, we'll have a roof and steady work. Your cousin, she's accepting of your situation, Lillian smiled slightly. Martha was always the rebel in the family. She went west on her own 10 years ago, built her business from nothing. When I wrote to her about Emma, she didn't hesitate to offer us a place. Good woman, Hugh approved. What about you? Lillian asked. Any family left? Hugh was quiet for so long that Lillian thought he might not answer. Had a wife once, he finally said, voice low, and a daughter. Yellow fever took them both in '68. That's when I came west. Understanding bloomed in Lillian's heart, his gentleness with Emma, the shadow that sometimes crossed his face when he looked at her. I'm sorry. Long time ago now, he said, though his eyes said otherwise. What was her name? Your daughter, Margaret. We called her Maggie. She was 4 when she passed. His voice remained steady, but his hands weren't as he added another log to the fire. Lillian moved without thinking, placing her hand over his. Thank you for telling me about them. Hugh looked startled at the contact but didn't pull away. For a moment they sat in silence, connected by shared loss despite their vastly different paths. Better get some rest, he finally said, gently withdrawing his hand. Got another long day tomorrow. As Lillian settled in the tent with Emma, she found herself thinking about Hugh Irwin, a man who had known profound loss, yet still stopped to help strangers in a storm. She wondered what kind of life he truly led in his isolated cabin, if the solitude was a choice or a sentence he'd imposed upon himself. The second day of travel brought them through a steep mountain pass where the wagon wheels slipped precariously on loose shale. Hugh handled the team with expert precision, talking to the horses in low, soothing tones when they grew nervous. "You're good with them," Lillian observed as they stopped to rest the animals at midday. Hugh patted one of the horses, a sturdy bay he called Chester, with obvious affection. "Animals don't judge, they just want fair treatment and a firm hand, easier to understand than most people." "Is that why you prefer your mountain to town?" He considered her question with typical thoughtfulness. "Partly. Town means neighbors with opinions and expectations. Out here, a man answers only to himself and God." "And which is the harsher judge?" Lillian asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Hugh's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Depends on the day, I suppose." That evening they camped by a clear stream where Hugh caught 3 trout for their supper. As they ate, Emma began fussing, clearly tired from the long day's travel. "May I?" Hugh asked, holding out his arms. Surprised, Lillian handed Emma to him. Hugh settled the baby against his shoulder and began humming a tune Lillian didn't recognize, something slow and sweet with a melancholy edge. Emma's eyes grew heavy almost immediately. "You remembered," Lillian said softly. "Some things you don't forget," Hugh replied, carefully transferring the now sleeping baby back to her mother. "No matter how many years pass." The 3rd day of their journey took them out of the mountains and into rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the valley where Angel's camp sat. The terrain was easier now, allowing conversation as they traveled. "Tell me about your ranch," Lillian prompted, genuinely curious about his life. "Hardly a ranch," Hugh demurred. "Just 40 acres with a cabin and a small herd, enough to keep me in food and supplies." "Do you ever get lonely?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Don't think about it much," he finally said. "Got used to my own company." "I think I'd find it terrifying," Lillian confessed. "Being so far from other people." Hugh glanced at her. "You're braver than you think, heading west with just a baby and hope." "It wasn't bravery," she said. "It was necessity. Bravest things usually are." They lapsed into comfortable silence until Emma began babbling happily, reaching toward a hawk circling overhead. "She's going to be a handful when she starts walking," Hugh observed, amusement warming his usually guarded expression. "She already is," Lillian laughed. "I can barely keep her contained when we stop. She wants to explore everything." "Good quality in a frontier child," Hugh approved. "Curiosity keeps the mind sharp." As the sun began to set, they made camp for what Hugh promised would be their last night on the trail. "We'll reach Angel's camp by midday tomorrow," he said as he built the fire. Lillian felt an unexpected pang at his words. In just 3 days, she had grown accustomed to Hugh's quiet presence, his careful attention to her and Emma's comfort. The thought of bidding him farewell brought a hollow feeling she wasn't prepared for. "Will you stay in town for a while?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Hugh shook his head. "Just long enough to pick up supplies. Got animals waiting back home that need tending." "Of course," Lillian nodded, busying herself with Emma to hide her disappointment. Later, as they sat by the fire watching the stars emerge, Hugh cleared his throat. "That cousin of yours, Martha, she expecting you on a particular day?" "Not really. I wrote that we'd likely arrive sometime next week." Hugh nodded, seeming to consider something. "If your leg's still troubling you, there's no rush. Could rest another day before heading into town." Lillian looked at him, wondering if he was simply concerned for her welfare or if perhaps he too was reluctant for their journey to end. "It is a bit sore still," she admitted, though the pain had largely subsided. Then it settled. "We'll take tomorrow easy, let you rest up before meeting your cousin." The relief Lillian felt was far greater than the situation warranted. One more day with this quiet, thoughtful man who had rescued them from certain tragedy. One more day before facing the new life that awaited in Angel's camp. That night, as they sat talking by the fire long after Emma had fallen asleep, Hugh revealed more of himself than he had in all the previous days combined. He spoke of his childhood in eastern Tennessee, his father's small farm, his time in the Union Army despite his state's Confederate leanings, and the painful return home to find his parents gone and the farm destroyed. Met my wife in a refugee camp, he explained. She'd lost everyone too. Guess that's what drew us together, that shared emptiness. And you were happy? Lillian asked gently. For the first time, Hugh smiled fully, a transformation that softened his entire face. We were. Those 4 years were the happiest of my life. Even with the hardships after the war, having Eliza and Maggie, it felt like I'd been given more than I deserved. And after you lost them, his smile faded. Couldn't bear to stay where every street, every corner held memories, sold what little we had and just started west. Kept going until I found a place so different from Tennessee that nothing could remind me of what I'd lost. He stared into the fire. Fool's errand that, memories follow a man no matter how far he runs. Yet you've made a life there, Lillian observed. A existence, Hugh corrected. Not sure I'd call it a life. What would make it a life? She asked, holding her breath as she waited for his answer. Hugh looked at her then, really looked at her, and Lillian felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since that stormy night. Things I stopped letting myself want a long time ago, he finally said, his voice rough. Before Lillian could respond, Emma let out a small cry from the tent. The moment broke as Lillian rose to tend to her daughter, but the echo of Hugh's words and the intensity of his gaze stayed with her through the night. The next morning brought clear skies and a tacit agreement not to mention their late-night conversation. They took their time breaking camp, then traveled at a leisurely pace that allowed for stops whenever something caught Emma's interest: a flowering bush, a colorful bird, a stream where tiny fish darted in the shallows. "You're good with her," Lillian observed as Hugh patiently showed Emma how to toss pebbles into the water. Most men would have grown impatient with so many delays. Hugh shrugged. Seems a shame to rush when there's so much for her to see. Little ones notice things adults forget to look for. They stopped for a midday meal in a sunny meadow dotted with wildflowers. Hugh spread a blanket for Emma to crawl on while Lillian prepared a simple lunch from their dwindling supplies. Angel's camp is just beyond that ridge, Hugh said, pointing to the hills ahead. We could be there in 2 hours if we pushed on. Lillian looked at him, at the man who had saved their lives and shown such care on their journey. The thought of saying goodbye in just 2 hours made her heart constrict painfully. Or, she prompted, hearing the unspoken alternative in his tone. Or we could make camp early, reach town fresh in the morning. He avoided her eyes, focusing on breaking a twig between his fingers. Your choice. I think, Lillian said carefully, that after so much travel, one more night under the stars would be pleasant. The relief in Hugh's expression was unmistakable. They spent the afternoon in the meadow, gathering wood for the fire, picking berries from a nearby thicket, and watching Emma delight in the butterflies that fluttered among the wildflowers. As the sun began its descent, casting golden light across the meadow, Hugh surprised Lillian by producing a small harmonica from his pocket. Haven't played this in years, he admitted, turning the tarnished instrument in his hands. Found it when I was packing for this trip. Used to play for Maggie before bedtime. Would you play something now? Lillian asked. Hugh hesitated, then lifted the harmonica to his lips. The tune that emerged was sweet and simple, a lullaby that had Emma watching him with wide, fascinated eyes. When he finished, there was a moment of silence broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark. That was beautiful, Lillian said softly. Hugh looked embarrassed but pleased. Eliza used to say music was good for the soul. Guess I forgot that for a while. As evening settled around them and the first stars appeared, they sat side by side watching the fire. Emma had fallen asleep in a nest of blankets nearby, her small face peaceful in slumber. Lillian, Hugh began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. Yes, she encouraged gently. I know we've only known each other a few days, and I have no right to ask this, but he took a deep breath. Would you consider not staying in Angel's camp? Lillian's heart began to race. What do you mean? Hugh turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "I mean, would you consider coming back to the mountains with me?" "You and Emma." When Lillian didn't immediately respond, words stuck in her throat from surprise, he hurried on. "I know it's not much, a small cabin, a hard life, not nearly what a woman like you deserves. But I swear I'd work every day to make it better, to build something worthy of you both." "Hugh," Lillian finally managed, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said, a vulnerability in his eyes that nearly broke her heart. "And I know it's too soon, that you barely know me. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just consider it, please." Lillian reached out, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I do know you, Hugh Irwin. I know you're a man who stops to help strangers in a storm, who carries a baby to safety before anything else, who buried a man you never met because it was the right thing to do." She moved closer, emboldened by the hope growing in his eyes. "I know you're a man who remembers how to play lullabies even when you've had no one to play them for in years, who sees beauty in small things and has patience for a child's curiosity." "Lillian," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I came west looking for a safe haven for Emma and me," she continued. "I thought I would find it in Angel's Camp with my cousin and her shop, but maybe—" She took a deep breath, scarcely believing her own boldness. "Maybe we were meant to find it with you in your mountains." Hugh's hand tightened around hers. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying I'd like to try," Lillian answered honestly. "I can't promise I'll be suited to mountain life, but I'd like the chance to find out." The smile that transformed Hugh's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers, a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "We'll go to Angel's Camp tomorrow," he said when they parted. "You should see your cousin, let her know you're safe. We can stay a few days, get supplies, give you time to be certain this is what you want. And if it is, then we'll find a preacher," Hugh said simply, "and I'll take you home." That night, Lillian lay awake long after Hugh had fallen asleep, her mind racing with the unexpected turn her journey had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a desperate widow, or so he'd thought, with nothing but hope and a cousin's promise to sustain her. Now she was contemplating marriage to a man she'd known less than a week. By all rational measures, it was madness. Yet in her heart, Lillian felt a certainty she couldn't explain. Hugh Irwin might be a near stranger by the calendar's reckoning, but in the ways that mattered, in character and kindness, in his gentle hands and thoughtful heart, she knew him well enough. Angel's Camp appeared on the horizon just before noon the next day, a growing settlement nestled in a valley, with white clapboard buildings and streets busy with wagons and riders. "Your cousin's shop?" Hugh asked as they approached the town limits. "On Main Street," she wrote. A blue sign with gold lettering, Vance Dressmaking and Alterations. They found it easily enough, a tidy storefront with a display window showcasing a finely made woman's suit and several decorative bonnets. Hugh helped Lillian down from the wagon, then carefully lifted Emma into her arms. "Would you like me to come in with you?" he asked, suddenly seeming uncertain of his place. Lillian reached for his hand. "Yes, please." The bell above the door jingled as they entered. A woman looked up from where she was measuring fabric at a long table, a handsome woman in her 40s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and Lillian's same green eyes. "Lillian," she gasped, setting down her shears. "Good heavens, you're early. I wasn't expecting you until next week." The women embraced, Martha careful not to crush Emma between them. "And this must be little Emma." "Oh, she has your eyes, Lillian." Only then did Martha seem to notice Hugh standing awkwardly by the door, hat in hands. "And who might this be?" "Martha, this is Hugh Irwin," Lillian said, a warmth in her voice that made Martha's eyebrows rise. "He saved our lives when our wagon overturned in the storm 3 days ago. He's brought us safely to you." Martha studied the tall cowboy with open curiosity. "Then I owe you my gratitude, Mr. Irwin. I don't know what I would have done if anything had happened to these two." Hugh nodded respectfully. "Just fortunate I was passing by, madam." Martha's shrewd eyes moved from Hugh to Lillian and back again. Something tells me there's more to this story than a simple rescue. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. Perhaps we could talk privately, Martha. Martha showed them to the living quarters behind the shop, a comfortable apartment with windows overlooking a small garden. While Hugh excused himself to see to the horses, Lillian told her cousin everything. The accident, Hugh's rescue, the journey to Angel's camp, and finally, his proposal. "Married," Martha exclaimed when Lillian finished. "To a man you've known 4 days. Lillian, have you lost your senses?" "Perhaps," Lillian admitted, "but Martha, I've never been so sure of anything. You should see him with Emma and the way he cares for us both." Martha sat back, studying her younger cousin. "You're in love with him." It wasn't a question, but Lillian answered anyway. "Yes." "As impossible as that sounds, yes." "It doesn't sound impossible at all," Martha said, her expression softening. "Just unexpected and quick." "Too quick," Martha sighed. "Who am I to judge the pace of another's heart? Lord knows I've made my share of impulsive decisions." She reached for Lillian's hand. "Does he make you happy?" "Yes," Lillian said without hesitation. "Happier than I thought possible after everything that's happened. And this mountain home of his, you're prepared for that life. It won't be easy, especially with a little one." "I know. But Hugh says we can come to town regularly, and he's already talking about adding rooms to the cabin, maybe hiring help for the ranch." Martha nodded slowly. "Well then, seems you found what you came west for, just not where you expected." She squeezed Lillian's hand. "If you're certain, you have my blessing, but promise me one thing, anything, stay a week. Get to know each other in surroundings less desperate than a storm or a wilderness journey. Make sure this is truly what you both want." Lillian considered this reasonable request. "I'll speak to Hugh." "I think he'd agree that's wise." Hugh did agree, and so began a week that Lillian would later remember as a kind of courtship. They'd done in reverse, starting with a proposal and working backward to the getting-to-know-you phase that usually came first. Angel's camp offered opportunities they hadn't had on the trail. They shared meals in the town's small restaurant, attended a church social where Hugh surprised everyone with his decent dancing, and spent afternoons in Martha's garden while Emma napped. Hugh proved to be more talkative in town than he had been in the wilderness, as if proximity to other people reminded him of social conventions. Lillian discovered he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and an encyclopedic knowledge of Western flora and fauna that he shared with genuine enthusiasm. For his part, Hugh watched with undisguised admiration as Lillian skillfully helped in Martha's shop, her fingers flying over fine fabrics, creating order from chaos. "You're an artist with that needle," he observed on their 4th day in town, as she completed a complicated alteration for one of Martha's clients. Lillian smiled at the compliment. "My mother taught me. She always said a woman who can sew will never go hungry." "You could have a good life here," Hugh said quietly, a question in his tone that hadn't been there before. Lillian set down her work and moved to sit beside him. "Is that what you're worried about? That I'll change my mind because town life might be easier?" Hugh looked away. "Would be understandable if you did. Your cousin's offering you a partnership in her shop. Emma would have other children to play with, a proper school when she's older." "Hugh," Lillian said firmly, turning his face toward hers, "I'm not choosing between an easy life and you. I'm choosing the life that feels right, the life with the man who reached back for my hand when everything was falling apart around us." The vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her heart. "You're sure?" "More sure with each passing day," she assured him. On their final evening in Angel's camp, Martha hosted a small dinner for them, inviting the local preacher and his wife as well as a few of her friends. It was a merry gathering, full of good wishes for the couple who would be married the next morning before departing for their mountain home. Later, as Hugh walked Lillian back to her room at the boarding house where he'd insisted she stay, he himself slept in the livery stable, propriety being important to him. They paused under the star-filled sky. "Last chance to change your mind," Hugh said softly, only half joking. Lillian reached up to touch his bearded cheek. "The only thing I'm changing is my name. Tomorrow, I'll be Lillian Irwin." Hugh covered her hand with his own. "I never thought I'd hear another woman say that name as her own. After Eliza and Maggie, I believed that part of my life was over forever. And now I believe in second chances," he said, bending to kiss her with a tenderness that held the promise of their future together. The wedding took place the following morning in Angels Camp's small white church. Martha had worked through the night to alter one of her fine dresses for Lillian, a dove gray silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Hugh wore a new shirt and had finally allowed the local barber to trim his beard, revealing more of his handsome face. Emma, dressed in a tiny white frock Martha had also created, watched wide-eyed from her perch in Martha's arms as her mother and the cowboy who had rescued them spoke their vows before God and the small gathering of witnesses. "I take you, Lillian, to be my wife," Hugh said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Lillian repeated the same vows, her voice clear and unwavering, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even the preacher seemed moved by the obvious love between these two people who had found each other in the most unexpected circumstances. "By the power vested in me," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Irwin, you may kiss your bride." Hugh's kiss was gentle but held a promise of deeper passion to come. When they turned to face their small audience as husband and wife, Martha stepped forward with Emma. "I believe this little one belongs to both of you now," she said, placing the baby in Hugh's strong arms. The sight of her new husband holding her daughter with such care and obvious love confirmed for Lillian that she had made the right choice. This was her family now, unexpected, unconventional, but absolutely right. They left Angels Camp that afternoon, their wagon loaded with wedding gifts and supplies for their mountain home. Martha hugged Lillian fiercely at their departure. "You'll bring that child to visit her Aunt Martha regularly," she insisted, wiping away tears, "and I'll expect detailed letters." "We'll come for Christmas," Lillian promised, "and you must visit us once we've expanded the cabin." Hugh helped his new wife and daughter into the wagon, then shook Martha's hand. "Thank you for understanding," he said simply. Martha gave him a measured look. "Just make them happy, Mr. Irwin." "That's all I ask. Every day of my life," he vowed. The journey back to Hugh's mountain home took the same 3 days as their trip to Angels Camp, but everything felt different now. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but a family making their way home. Each night, after Emma was asleep, they explored their new relationship as husband and wife, discovering each other with wonder and growing passion. Hugh proved to be a gentle and considerate lover, and Lillian found herself falling even deeper in love with this man who had transformed her life so completely. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the cabin came into view, small but sturdy against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. "It's not much," Hugh said, an echo of his words from that first stormy night. "It's home," Lillian corrected him, Emma babbling happily in her lap as if in agreement. Hugh's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Yes," he said, taking her hand. "Now it is." The following months brought changes to the small cabin and its inhabitants. True to his word, Hugh began expanding their home, adding a proper bedroom for them and a smaller one for Emma. Lillian planted a vegetable garden and learned to preserve the bounty for winter months. She also set up a small workstation where she continued her sewing, taking in occasional work from neighboring ranches and the nearest settlement. Emma thrived in the mountain air, growing stronger and more curious each day. She took her first steps on the cabin porch with both parents watching proudly, and her first word, "Papa," brought tears to Hugh's eyes that he didn't try to hide. By the time winter arrived, bringing snow that transformed their mountain into a glittering wonderland, the cabin had become a true home filled with love, laughter, and the sweet sounds of a family finding its rhythm together. On Christmas Eve, as promised, they made the journey to Angel's Camp to spend the holiday with Martha. The town had decorated for the season, and Emma's eyes grew round at the sight of the Christmas tree in the town square, its candles glowing against the darkening sky. Martha embraced them all warmly, exclaiming over how much Emma had grown and how well Lillian looked. "Marriage clearly agrees with you, cousin." That night, after a festive dinner in Martha's cozy apartment, Hugh took Lillian's hand and led her to the quiet corner where Martha's Christmas tree stood adorned with handmade ornaments and tiny candles. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Wanted to give it to you privately before tomorrow's festivities." Lillian unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Emma on one side and Hugh on the other, skillfully rendered by a photographer in the mining town 30 miles from their home. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the images with reverent fingers. "Thought you might like having us close to your heart," Hugh said, helping her fasten it around her neck. "Even though we're already there." Lillian reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man, once a stranger who appeared in a storm, had become the center of her world. "I love you, Hugh Irwin." "And I love you, Lillian Irwin," he replied, bending to kiss her beneath the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. "More than I ever thought possible." Martha found them there moments later, still in each other's arms. "Well," she said with a knowing smile, "I believe I owe you an apology, Lillian." "Whatever for?" "For doubting the wisdom of marrying a man you'd known less than a week." She patted Hugh's arm affectionately. "Clearly, your heart knew what it was doing." Spring brought new beginnings to the Irwin household. The mountain bloomed with wildflowers, the creek ran full with snowmelt, and Lillian discovered she was expecting their first child together. When she shared the news with Hugh one evening as they sat on the porch watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard, his response was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he breathed, his hand moving reverently to her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" She asked, though his shining eyes had already answered. "Happier than I deserve to be," he admitted, gathering her into his arms. "I never thought I'd have this again, a family, a future hope." As her pregnancy progressed, Lillian found herself marveling at the twists of fate that had brought her to this life. If the wagon hadn't overturned in that storm, if Hugh hadn't been passing by at that exact moment, if he hadn't lifted Emma to safety first, then reached back for her hand. Their son was born on a crisp October morning with Martha in attendance, having made the journey from Angel's Camp as soon as Hugh's urgent message reached her. After hours of labor, Lillian gave birth to a healthy boy with Hugh's dark hair and her green eyes. "What shall we call him?" Hugh asked as he cradled his newborn son, all written across his features. Lillian smiled tiredly from the bed they shared. "I thought perhaps Thomas, after your father." Hugh's eyes grew damp. "Thomas Irwin," he tested the name, then nodded. "It's perfect." Little Thomas grew quickly, adored by both parents and his big sister, who appointed herself his special protector. Emma, now nearly 2, took her responsibilities seriously, bringing her favorite toys to share with the baby and reading to him from her picture books. The small family's life settled into a pleasant rhythm. Hugh's cattle business prospered enough to hire a young ranch hand who lived in a small cabin nearby. This allowed him more time with his family and for the improvements he continuously made to their home. Lillian's sewing skills brought in a steady income as her reputation spread through the region. Women would travel considerable distances for her fine work, and she began teaching Emma the basics of the craft as soon as the little girl could hold a needle. 2 years after Thomas's birth, the family welcomed another daughter, Catherine, named for Lillian's mother. With 3 children and a thriving homestead, the Irwins were the picture of frontier prosperity and happiness. On the 5th anniversary of the storm that had brought them together, Hugh took Lillian to a special spot on their property, a high meadow overlooking the valley, where wildflowers grew in profusion and the view stretched for miles. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they sat on a blanket, watching their children play among the flowers. "Marrying a rough mountain man you barely knew, trading a comfortable town life for all this work and isolation." Lillian leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Not for a single moment. Everything I need is right here." Hugh turned to face her, his expression solemn. "That night when I found your wagon overturned in the storm, I wasn't supposed to be on that trail at all." "What do you mean?" "I'd taken a wrong turn miles back, was trying to find my way in the storm. Should have been nowhere near where you were." He squeezed her hand. "Sometimes I think it wasn't chance at all." Lillian smiled, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. "Maybe it wasn't. Maybe some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." Hugh brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as gentle as it had been the first time he'd reached for her hand amid the wreckage of her old life. "I used to think losing Eliza and Maggie was the end of my story. Now I know it was just one chapter. You and our children, you're the rest of the book." "A long book," Lillian said, leaning in to kiss him, "with many chapters still to come." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the Irwin family made their way back to the cabin that had become a home, the unexpected sanctuary Lillian had been seeking when she set out for Angel's Camp all those years ago. That night, with their children sleeping peacefully and the mountain wrapped in starlit darkness, Lillian and Hugh stood on their porch, arms around each other, grateful for the storm that had changed the course of their lives, and for the love that had grown from the ruins of a wagon overturned on a rain-soaked mountain trail. Hugh's arm tightened around her waist. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Irwin." Lillian smiled up at him, her heart full. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Irwin." And in that moment, surrounded by the life they had built together, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how they begin, lead exactly where they're meant to.